Good evening, dear friends, and it's my sincere pleasure to welcome you all on our fourth meeting under the umbrella term of the New Now, and particularly this meeting is a pride point for us. That this little thing that was secret until now, but I want to share it with you. The thing is that a few months ago, when in Manege we heard the Venice Biennale, we couldn't even imagine that the commissioner is going to be here himself, because this term kept popping up while discussing the Russian Pavilion and Alexander Shishkin-Hokusai, you know, he can hold me accountable for that, because, you know, for months prior to this meeting, Manege had to do with the Venice Biennale, and our guest today, our very important guest today, who's very important for the contemporary art and for the realm of culture of person around the world, Mr. Ralph Rugoff, the commissioner of the 58th Venice Biennale, head of the Hayrup Gallery, and I think Anna, who is the author of the idea of now, is going to moderate our conversation today, and she is going to try to make sure that we hear plenty of interesting stories, because I'm confident Ralph has plenty of those. But before we begin, I'd like to thank our partners. First of all is the Istituto Italiano di Cultura, and Paolo Cioni's director, Mega Dibenka, the partner of our program. And once again, I would like to welcome you all here and give the floor to Paola. Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Prigara and all of the workers of Manege for our joint work, and of course, our honorary guest, Mr. Rugoff, for accepting our invitation to come here and to introduce the International Venice Biennale. That is one of the most important art and culture events both in Italy and worldwide. But apart from that, I have been at the opening of the Russian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, and to be honest with you, it was one of the most interesting pavilions. So I want to thank everyone who worked to make sure that project actually happened. And naturally, I want to thank everyone who came here today. And I can only wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you ever so much. Dear friends, good evening. Once again, thank you to Manege. We have this improvised lecture hall over here as part of the IS Plus Air exhibition. And you have a unique opportunity to talk to the commissioner of the current Venice Biennale.
So, Rolf, welcome to Manege. We are very excited to have you here. I've made a very short introduction to the Biennale itself and to who you are and to your curatorial experience. I suggest that first we start talking with about your curatorial approach to the Biennale. The theme of the Biennale is curating in interesting times. Maybe only even interesting times. Sorry, that was the title of our talk. So what are those interesting times? Could you give us more? What's your take on those times? And who are the artists who create in those times?
First, let me just say thank you for inviting me here. And it's a real pleasure to be here in this wonderful building that I didn't know anything about until quite recently. But I'm very impressed. And maybe we can just let the images roll on the projection while we're talking, and they can be a background. to me, a biennale is sort of like a clock, in that it happens every 2 years. So it's a way of measuring time. What makes a biennale a biennale? The name says every 2 years. So for me, that was a starting point. And so I like to think of a biennale as being able to reflect on things that have happened in the last couple of years, things that maybe are becoming more prominent, different ways of thinking, different ways of processing information, different ways of having relationships with the world. And over the last 2 years, which from my very biased kind of European American perspective, two big things that happened was Brexit and the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States. And both of these things had something very much in common, is that they both happened, they were able to happen because of an endless tissue of lies that both the pro-Brexit people and Trump himself continued to pour out, often via social media. And it seemed to me that this idea of fake news is something that's become institutionalized in a different way. We all know there's always been, governments have always twisted and spun the news to serve themselves. But it's taken on a new dimension, and one in which I think it's much more polarizing. And while human beings, I think, have always had the capacity to see things only from one perspective, I think something about the rise of the internet and of social media has amplified this experience. I think people who are talking to themselves on social media, because when you're writing, it is a monologue, and there's no immediate feedback from someone else who might tell you, no, what you're saying is complete nonsense. It's much easier to think that whatever you're writing is the truth. And one of the amazing things that social media created was news channels where you can be very specific that you only want to hear certain kinds of news from a certain kind of perspective. So you can make your own version of the world, which reinforces what you already feel and think. And so to me, it's not so surprising that in many, many countries in the world, we see countries that are completely polarized, that are split down the middle, that cannot really even form a functioning government. And the two sides can't speak to each other because they really believe in different facts. And the advisor to Trump, Kellyanne Conway, came up with this phrase, alternative facts. This was when Trump was claiming that many, many more people had come to his inauguration as president than had come to Obama's, even though there were photographs that showed that Obama had probably twice as many people there. And you look at the photographs of Trump's inauguration crowd, and it's obviously very small. And in defending Trump, this advisor said, well, he has alternative facts, as if facts weren't based in the real world, but we could all have facts to prove whatever we wanted to prove. So early on, this was one area that I thought could provide a structure one way or another, because I think that artists also provide us with alternatives, not with alternative facts, because I don't think artists really deal with facts, but with alternative perspectives, alternative ways of seeing, ways of thinking, alternative ways of making connections between things. So this title, May You Live in Interesting Times, when I was a young person, this was frequently cited as being an ancient Chinese curse. And it was a curse because interesting meant unstable, precarious, times of disaster potentially, as opposed to a nice, boring, stable time. So you would say to your enemy, may your children live in interesting times. But it turns out, even though this phrase was used by many famous politicians, including Hillary Clinton, it was used by famous French writers, Nobel Prize winners like Albert Camus, it's not a real Chinese proverb. It's fake news. It was made up by a British diplomat in the early 20th century. And the first time it appeared in print was when a British member of parliament was giving a speech about Hitler, who had just moved his army into Eastern Europe, which was in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which had been signed after World War I. So it was at a moment when the world seemed to be changing very powerful political relationships. And it seems to me that we're in a time where that's also happening. And whereas we've seen around the world, there are many new nationalist parties that are on the rise. But I also like the idea that if you're going to reflect on what's been going on in the world for the last 2 years, and you don't want to be unbearably depressing about it, because we know there are many serious, life-threatening issues affecting us all, that this title, besides evoking fake news, was also a challenge. May you live in interesting times. How is it that we can respond to this moment in an interesting way and not just feel like overwhelmed by bad news? At the same time, I have to say that art is not journalism. Art is not about the writing of history. But artists live in the same world we do, and they respond to it. And those responses, I wanted to look for artists whose work was, in one way or another, talking about the world we live in, but not in a simple way, but in a multi-layered way that allowed for the different meanings and possibilities of this time to come through. There's a wonderful French art historian in the 20th century, a guy named Henri Faucillon, who was asking, how can an artist ever be said to represent the time that they live in, when no time in history is ever singular, when every time is a meeting of different trajectories from the past that cross each other in different ways, when every time contains different flagrant contradictions. So times are not singular, they're not heterogeneous. And I think that's also important, not to put the burden on an artist of having to somehow represent their time or their country.
So what were your criteria in the process of the selection of the artists?
Well, one early idea that also shaped how I thought about the artists was I wanted to create an alternative biennale. And I actually wanted to spread a rumor that one of the biennales was fake and had been curated by somebody else, but that didn't work out. But so I came up with the structure of dividing the biennale into two separate sections. And it also came about because there are two main buildings for the International Pavilion. One's called the Arsenale, which was a rope-making factory for the Italian Navy. And the other section is called the International Pavilion, and it was a neoclassical gallery designed in the late 19th century. Completely different spaces, and if you put the same piece of work in either space, it'll feel completely different. So I also wanted to have two different shows that would reflect different ideas, but were made by the same artists. So to get across the idea that artists don't do just one thing, they don't speak in just one voice, that their practice contains alternatives, and to give you, as a visitor, the chance to see the same artist, but doing something different in each building, rather than seeing twice as many artists and having a less in-depth encounter with their work. So that meant from the beginning, I had to find artists who did two different things that I liked, and that were very different from each other. It also meant I was looking for artists who were looking at the world around them, but not in a simplistic way, and who made work that really was multivalent. It had different, a sense of contradictions, of ambiguity, that was able to juggle different perspectives, to do all the things that I don't see happening very much in mainstream media, including social media.
But May You Live in Interesting Times is not exactly like a theme, it's more like an impulse. So there was not something that would restrict the artists in the two works they would present. So that was actually something new, and the split format exhibition was, I guess it happened for the first time in the recent history of the Biennale, if not the entire history of the Biennale, because usually the main project occupies those two very different buildings in very different locations, but that is just one exhibition, so you made it into two completely different ones. And did they feel like they're called Proposition A and Proposition B? Ralph, did they feel now in the end, after several months of the biennial operation, do they feel like coherent, that there really are two coherent exhibitions existing completely separately from one another?
I mean, they definitely don't exist separately from each other. It's more like a case of quantum entanglement, where particles in different parts of the universe somehow are entangled and mirror each other's behavior. But at the same time, it's like the difference between seeing someone you know in the street and then seeing them that night in a dream. You recognize them, but it's different. And I think that's the experience, as a lot of people have told me, of coming across an artist in one space and then seeing their very different work somewhere else. And they know there's some connection, but you have to think about it a little bit sometimes in order to get it. So there are two exhibitions that are related. And sometimes the artists are talking about similar things in each place. And, but I think they have a different feeling to them, yeah.
And how much time did you have for the entire selection and the selection process and the preparation as far as the artist selection is concerned?
Not enough time. And if I possibly could, I would convince the people who run the Biennale to change a little bit their schedule, because they don't like to select the next curator until the end of the previous exhibition. So that means you get a phone call and it comes out of the blue. You have no idea someone's going to call you and invite you to lunch in Rome. That happens at the end of November, but then you need another month before you can be officially approved. But also, you haven't made any space in your calendar for doing this big project. You actually have other projects that you're already working on and require all your attention. So by the time you're actually able to find some free time, you only have about 7 or 8 months in order to organize your list of artists. And really, 2 years would be a much better amount of time.
Does that include a lot of traveling? Have you traveled extensively?
You travel as much as you can, and you also do a lot of research. Someone I was talking to today was saying, is it harder now because there's so much information available? Now that we have this huge amount of information on the internet, every artist in the world has their own website with very good documentation. But I think, so yeah, you could do endless research and it never ends. I mean, the good news is that there actually are lots of really good artists in the world. And you can only have so many of them in your exhibition. And there are lots of good artists who I didn't choose because they'd just been in one of the biennales. So one of the first things they do in Venice is they give you the list of everyone who's ever been in a biennale. And you look at who's been in the recent ones, and you kind of have to cross them off your list, because it doesn't seem to make sense to have them come back very soon again. But one thing I did that helped simplify things was that when I knew that there was an artist who I was definitely going to invite, and I met with them, I asked them if they would recommend another artist, an artist who they would like to be in the same room with, whose work, because there are always these famous stories about the Biennale of artists refusing to be in the same room as another artist, and the curator has to come in and suddenly change their whole plan. So I thought, okay, let's see if we can actually have a situation where, because there's no theme in an obvious way, but I want the works to feel connected, maybe there's some other way of. My thinking was that if an artist recommended another artist, there must be some way that their works are connected. So this was very productive, very helpful for me. I also thought it was important that the artists were my co-curators in some way.
And 79 artists or artist groups in the end. That is not a big amount for the Venice Biennale, I guess.
No, the previous two were 125 and 130. And because there were several artist groups, I really had about 75 individual artists. And even that, at the end, I just was back for the first time since the opening. And I thought if I only had 5 artists left, it would have worked much better. 5 fewer. Because some areas were just too crowded.
Rolf, just a step aside from Venice, may I ask you, have you been to Russia while selecting the artists? Because obviously there was no Russian artist included in the final list. So have you been to Russia? Have you seen?
I hadn't visited Russia. At one point I was hoping to. And then as you reach the last few months, you find that you can barely move. But there were a number of Russian artists I was keeping close track of, some of whom I've shown before at the Hayward Gallery or at the Lyon Biennale. And of course, I was seeing international exhibitions in many different places. So I would go to the Liverpool Biennale, say, and run into a Russian artist whose work I very much liked. And I think one reason in the past there's always been 130 artists is because people count countries, and they want to make sure that they've got people from as many different countries as possible. And I decided I was going to sacrifice that country counting. And there are now 300 biennales in the world. That means there's one opening almost every day. Well, but of course they happen only every 2 years, so every 4 days, let's say. Why do we have so many what makes this one different. And I think the one key thing that makes the Venice Biennale very different is that it has this group of national pavilions. And there are now 95 national pavilions, which have nothing to do with what the international curator is doing. Each national pavilion is independently run by the people from that country. So you know that even if I didn't have any Brazilian artists, which I didn't, any artists from Pakistan, which I didn't, that there's still a Brazilian pavilion and there's still a Pakistani pavilion. And on my final list, when I had about 150 people, and I knew I wanted to cut it down in half, I had 2 Russian artists, and I was pretty sure one of them would make it. I had 2 Brazilian artists, and I was pretty sure at least one of them would make it. And then I ended up losing them both. There were artists from Lithuania, Ukraine, Poland, Romania, so the former sphere of Soviet influence, but not from Russia itself. And that sometimes just happens almost really down to who the individuals you're looking at are, how they are different or the same from other artists you've already considered. Is their work going to fit into the overall flavor? And in this case, it didn't. Does that mean that I think there's not interesting artists in Russia?
Sure.
Or Brazil? No, there's great artists in both of these countries. But I was working in a slightly different way.
So we have mentioned the national pavilions at the Biennale. We all know there are over 90 national pavilions at the Venice Biennale, and this edition had at least 4 newcomers: amazing Ghana Pavilion, Madagascar, Pakistan, and Malaysia, if I'm not mistaken. So what is your curatorial take on the scheme of the national representation itself? Does it still work as a scheme of the national representation?
I don't think most artists want to say they're representing their country in an artistic way of some kind. And I think a positive thing is that, say, in the last 30 years, there have been almost 40 new pavilions, so that it's become much less Eurocentric in terms of the representation. At the same time, and I like the fact that there is no connection between the international exhibition and these national pavilions. So I know the national pavilions get critiqued a lot. What's the place of nationalism in an exhibition? But we live in a world where nations still exist, and the International Pavilion is a utopian dream, where people from all over the world come together in a peaceful cultural exchange. And that's a nice dream, but it's good to balance it with the reality of different nations who compete with each other, and that's the real world. Because I find that in most biennales that I've been to in different parts of the world, the curators formulate very idealistic utopian visions, taking seriously the idea that the Biennale is like a cultural version of the United Nations, only it works better than the United Nations somehow. And to me, that seems naive. But I think the biggest problem with the national pavilions for me is not the structure, which is very old-fashioned, it's true. It comes from the early 19th century world expositions. But it's the fact that in 2/3 of the countries, the commissioner is basically a government appointee. The commissioner is appointed by a government minister who knows nothing about art. And they appoint someone who often has very little knowledge of contemporary art. And they appoint an artist who often is far from being one of the better artists in that country. So there are countries that year after year have terrible pavilions, even though there are great artists in that country. And this is really literally 2/3, I would guess, of the pavilions suffer because of this. And what you really need is a kind of independent jury that selects an artist who is a leading contemporary artist in that country. But very few places do that. And so imagine if you had 95 great international pavilions. To me, that would be utopia.
Let's come back to the main project then. So this year you did something new with the split format and with the 2 exhibitions running simultaneously. Can you tell us a bit more about the architecture of the exhibition and the architectural framework that you've created? I read in one of your interviews that as a visitor to biennial, any biennial, you find it always quite difficult, to walk through all those corridors full of works of art. So how was your biennial different?
Someone asked me today what were the things that I wanted to do and couldn't. And one of them was to create a giant room in the middle of the Biennale with 300 beds where you could take a nap in the middle of the exhibition because it's so exhausting to go through it. To me, there's something about Biennales that is slightly sadistic because they give you far more art to look at and to try to understand than you possibly can absorb in 1 day or even 2 days. So one thing I tried to do was in the Arsenale, which is the biggest, longest place, though interestingly enough, it seems much bigger than this building, but you have almost the same square footage here. Is I tried to break it up into smaller pieces so that you wouldn't see this endless length and feel like you were in a giant supermarket for art. The Biennale, the Arsenale is also an old, crumbling brick building, very dirty walls, dirty floors. There's no way to make it look like a brand new, neat, contemporary space. 6 years ago, the curator wanted to do that, and he spent $2.5 million just on the architecture in the Arsenale. And it looked a lot better, but it still didn't look like a contemporary art space. So I tried to build something with a wonderful architect, a German in London, made out of plywood that had a rough-looking quality, the same quality as the space itself, and to create little sections that could exist slightly autonomously. They weren't completely closed off. But hopefully you just could take it in. It's in smaller pieces. And of course, I tried to have much fewer artists, so you also weren't having to absorb 130 new artistic languages that you'd never seen before in one visit. Then I also wanted to put some things outside of the pavilions, and I think in the Giardini, which is the area where there are a lot of the national pavilions, an Italian artist created a cloud that was always hovering over the building, and sometimes it would fall into the front entrance and come in through the front entrance. And this was a piece called, the building is called Thinking Head. But for me, it was a nice image of this kind of blurring of reality, fake news, real news. It's also softening the institutional authority of this neoclassical building. It made the pavilion next door very cross because the fog kept going into their pavilion. But I think their pavilion actually needed a little fog. So then there were also several other pieces outside. Actually, you can see right here what looks like a cardboard box is actually a sculpture made out of marble by a Greek artist, Andreas Lolis, who also had a couple of 3 black trash bags, also made of marble, that were lying outside. And when you're making these exhibitions, you're constantly bringing trash out of the building. And I wanted to have some feeling that this process was still going on. And when you walk in the streets of Venice, I'm always struck by the clothing lines that go from one building to the other. In most places where I've lived, you might have a clothing line that you controlled in your own house. But in Venice, I like the fact that you had to get your neighbor to agree who got the clothing line which day. And they're also very good at only putting out one color per day. So you see, the clothing line is red today, the next day it's yellow. It's like an art piece. So I asked Jana Kadyrova, an artist from Ukraine who makes work out of found tiles, ceramic tiles from abandoned buildings, to make some clothing that was hanging out the back of this building over the canal. And I think a lot of people might not even have noticed it. But I wanted to give this building a slightly less formal feeling.
Ralph, and who's the viewer of your exhibition, and what is the connection of you as a curator to your audience?
Well, I really hope that people come and if they have an open mind, they can have an interesting conversation with the works of art. And I was reading something by a psychologist recently who was talking about how the brain processes ideas. And when you have an idea, apparently, that idea activates other associated thoughts in your head. And in the past, logical philosophers have talked about, a chain of ideas. One idea leads to the next, leads to the next. But actually, they think it's much more complicated than that. One idea leads to your having about 20 other ideas at the same time. Most of them you're not even conscious of. And each of those ideas leads to another 20 ideas coming up at the same time. And I think this is how works of art engage us. And it's a very open process and open-ended. And it doesn't always make sense right away. I think if you understand a work of art immediately, it's probably not a very good work of art. It has to be a process, it has to take time, and it has to involve your own thought process because you're the person who interprets it. I'm not that interested in the artist's interpretation of their own work. So for me, the artist starts a conversation and creates the framework, but that conversation is something that the visitor has to finish. And hopefully not finish, because a good work of art, you never finish with it. You can't get rid of it, because you don't have a simple answer for what it's about. You have to keep working it out. And then it haunts you. And I think works of art can do that if they don't resolve all the tensions that they're dealing with. Because if a tension is resolved, you can get rid of it. But if it's not resolved, you have to keep working it out in your head, and you don't stop. So this is what I hope people, how they would react. And I try to find artists who give you a reason to get involved, meaning something about their work makes you curious, or it's visually exciting. This was a piece that was very spectacular, and but it could be a very quiet piece, but that has a quality that immediately captures your attention. But I think in order to do this, you know, someone, a journalist I was talking to earlier today asked me if I looked for work that was Instagrammable. Now, I'm one of the few people who probably doesn't do Instagram. But I said that, you know, I look for works that are visually interesting. And I think that most things that are visually interesting are probably going to be something you can share on Instagram.
Yeah, so that's exactly what you've mentioned before when you were talking about the interesting times and about the narrowing of the information. So the figure of a viewer, it is something that's completely opposite. So through this person, through this viewer, we kind of tend to broaden our perception of things and see maybe completely new connections. But have you, as a curator, heard in a way from the public, from the audience? Have you heard back? I mean, I don't mean the Guardian.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you hear from two different publics, and one, of course, is you hear from critics, and then you hear from people. But of course, you realize that there are not that many people who are going to tell you they hated it to your face. You know, so you have to take everything with, you know, a grain of salt, right? Generally, the people who will come up and say something to you are the people who liked it. So you try to realize that, okay, this doesn't mean everybody likes it. But I think one thing I was really struck by was that I tried to do a few things that were different in this Biennale. And because it was a Biennale about art's capacity to take on contradictory ideas and positions, I often put artists together who were quite different. But usually because I thought they were dealing with something quite similar, even if the work looked different. And this was something most critics either objected to because they didn't see any connection between the work, or they just said, I don't understand why he put these artists together. And to me, it was often quite obvious. And to the artists who I was putting together, everyone was like, yeah, this works. I understand why you're doing this. But I found that, in a way, the critics, professional art world people in general, are the worst audience because they already have, one, they already think they know everything, and they have so many categories and preconceptions about how things, what a Biennale is supposed to do, what a work of art is supposed to do, how a curator is supposed to act, that if you deviate from those positions, they think what you're doing is deeply flawed, that you're deviating not for a reason, but because somehow you failed to do what the normal way of working is. Whereas I find members of the public come in and are much more open-minded because they don't have all these categories and rules. And they also are more patient. And I myself am a very impatient viewer. So I know if I go in to watch a video, after 2 or 3 minutes, if I don't feel interested, I leave. But I'll see members of the public who will just sit there and really spend time with it. And sometimes it takes that time to begin to understand something that's new and different.
Maybe we could talk about some controversial pieces. Oh, sorry if I put it this way. I'm referring to it must be in the very end of this presentation. I'm referring to the piece by a Swiss artist. Is he Swiss? Yeah,
yes,
I guess
Christoph Boyka.
Yeah, exactly. So let me just find it. It's towards the end.
I mean, this is a work that was definitely the most controversial work in the Biennale. And again, I found it very interesting. And even my own opinion of this work changed over the last 3 months. And the artist was very interested in the European policy about immigration, and Italy is obviously in a key position as it's a landing point for many immigrants coming from Africa. And this was a boat that sank in the year 2015 off the coast of Italy, and 800 refugees on board died. This was a boat designed for a crew of 15 people, but 800 people had been packed onto that boat, and they were refugees from war-torn areas in the Middle East and in Africa. So they were people fleeing very bad situations. And the Italian government spent a lot of money to retrieve this boat from the bottom of the sea in order to help identify the bodies and also to do a forensic examination of why the boat sunk. So the artist spent an incredible amount of energy and time trying to get permission from the Italian government to bring this boat to the Venice Biennale, and then to raise money independently to physically bring it, because it has to travel on a huge tugboat. And before the Biennale, I asked him, you know, one, we had a text describing what his concerns were, why he was doing this, what had happened, and he said, no, there can be no text. And I had many huge arguments with him about this because I felt you have to provide a context for it. Then, as he was getting more extreme, I got more extreme. And I said, Christoph, I also think that, you know, people come to an art exhibition, they don't want to encounter a tragic artifact from a real-life tragedy. I think we should put the boat behind a kind of screen and tell people, okay, this is where the boat is. If you want to come and see it, this is what you're going to be looking at. So only people who were ready to look at it looked at it. And he said, you know, screw you, that's not going to happen in a million years. And I said, you know, we had many arguments again. And he wanted to place the boat at the end of this long pier that's at the back of this Arsenale complex, which used to be run by the Italian Navy. Some of it still is. And it was the Italian Navy that rescued this boat from the bottom of the sea. It couldn't, the boat, for structural reasons, because the ground wasn't stable enough, couldn't go at that point. And that was a great relief to me, because to me that was like the place you would put something for a postcard. And I thought, God, the last thing I want to see is just people coming out with their phones and taking pictures of this like it was a tourist site. And the artist said to me, Ralph, that's exactly what I want to have happen. And it took me about 3 months to realize how right he was and how wrong I was. And then the way it worked out is we placed the boat, and then the Biennale has a cafe. And it turned out the cafe was right next to the boat.
And this is why it gets so hugely criticized. As a matter of fact,
that added fuel to the fire. People already were going to hate it because but it's also very interesting. Again, in Italy, the press had no problems with this boat. And most of the Italian public I've talked to have had no problems with it. But the rest of the world seems to have a huge moral issue. And people say, how can you show this object in which people died as a work of art? But the artist was never claiming this was a work of art. And then people would say, how can you be so crass and callous as to show this next to a coffee place where people are having coffee and where people are going to take selfies in front of it? And you know, people can take selfies in Auschwitz. There's no way to stop people taking selfies. And when I just was back there and I saw it in front of the coffee place, and I was like, actually, this was the perfect place to put it, because this is the picture of our world. The people who criticized it were asking for a respectful, you know, kind of tragic installation that would acknowledge the sanctity of human life and would make everyone feel good about themselves. He made something much tougher than that. It was too tough for most of the newspaper critics. They didn't want to take a look at what this world we live in looks like. But it looks like people care more about their coffee than they do about the immigrants who are drowning off the coast of Europe. And the European Union still will not deal with this issue in an intelligent and comprehensive fashion. So I think the artist was right. And now I feel too bad that I argued with him so much. But you live and learn. And I will say something else. There was another work in the show, which we saw a picture of earlier, which is a wall made of cinder blocks with some barbed wire on the top. And this is a wall that an artist, Teresa Margolis, took from a school in Mexico, where a group of teenagers were assassinated by a drug gang. They were shot in front of this wall, and she actually took the actual wall and brought it. Nobody complained about that piece. At the Hayward Gallery, 7 years ago, we did a show with an artist, Jeremy Deller, a British artist. One of the pieces in his show was a car that had been destroyed by a car bomb in Baghdad. The car bomb was in the book district of Baghdad, and it was meant to destroy people who love books, intellectuals. 40 people died in that bombing. Nobody said it was a moral outrage to show that car in an art exhibition. And believe me, no one was presenting that car as an artwork. But sometimes an artist can make a gesture using something that isn't an artwork. So it was interesting to me that this piece got such universal condemnation. Is there like a limit that it's okay if 40 people died, but if it's more than 100, then you can't condone it? Right, exactly.
Ralph, you've just mentioned the Hayward Gallery. Now, after the Biennale is approaching its end towards 24th of November. So what are your current or future curatorial plans at Hayward and beyond, and how have they been affected by your experience in Venice, if they were at all?
Well, I think one lesson I learned in Venice from a curatorial point of view is that less is more most of the time. And this is a hard lesson for me to learn for some reason. But I think maybe it's finally going to stick. Because I really felt if only I'd had a little bit less, it would have been a stronger show. Somehow, I mean, the hardest thing about doing the Biennale is that you still have to do your normal job. And of course, you don't do it very well because you're focusing on something else. So I'm now very much focused on the Hayward and getting our future programming in place. In 2020, there was a strange thing in a few European countries and in the United States where I grew up called Earth Day. Earth Day was something that the environmental movement created in 1970. And so it was going to be the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And 2020 is also a year when a lot of climate scientists said that if we hadn't begun to cut down the amount of greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere will reach what's called a tipping point, where the change of global warming begins to happen much faster, and it becomes much harder to stop. It might seem like we're already at the tipping point. We now have twice as many tropical hurricanes as we used to have. We're seeing lots of weird weather all over the world, but I think it's going to get much worse. So it sounds really dumb, but I'm curating an exhibition about how artists have dealt with trees as a subject for the last 50 years. And I didn't want to do a show about global warming because I thought only people who already are strongly against global warming would come. But in England, everyone loves trees. But it gives you the opportunity to then to talk about lots of other issues. And I do think that this issue of global warming is something we can't ignore. And even flying here, I don't think I'll be doing this that much in the future. I mean, the art world, we all travel all the time. We ship work all over the world. And maybe I'll be taking the train next time I come here. I'm going to be spending more time on the train.
So the trees show in 2020 at Hayward. Do you have any?
Well, we're doing a lot of outdoor projects. So that's a new emphasis. And we have many other shows. We'll be doing a big exhibition about sound and artists who use sound to make work. And paying also a lot of attention to doing projects with artists from different African countries. So whatever we try to do at the Hayward, we have a very interesting brutalist building, and each room is quite different from the other rooms. So it gives artists the chance to bounce off of the architecture, to do something in response to it. Whereas most galleries, every room looks the same. So this kind of space where you can change it and make it completely different all the time, I think these are the most interesting spaces for exhibitions.
Ralph, you said in the beginning, and it's a fact, that currently worldwide there are over 300 international biennials. And in 2015, you created the Lyon Biennale under the theme La vie moderne, so modern life. So two grand experiences, two big experiences of creating the major art forums. So the question is, and that would be probably my last question today, what still makes the Venice Biennale stand out and still be the most prestigious, glamorized, and important art forum in the world?
Well, it's the oldest, so it's the mother of all biennales. And I have to say that I think the fact that it's in Venice is a big part of its magic. I mean, if you had the choice to go visit Lyon or Venice, how many people would go to Lyon? With all due respect, it's a nice city. But Venice is like a giant art piece in itself. And every time I go there, I'm amazed at what an incredibly beautiful, unique place it is. So, in fact, during the installation period where we were working, 14 hours a day for 6 weeks, and things were always late and you're under pressure, I enjoyed every minute of it because I was in Venice. It was amazing. So I think, this is a big thing that makes it special. And the other thing is just this dual structure, that all the countries have national pavilions, or 95 of them, and no other biennale has this strange structure. But I think in a weird way it works.
Ralph, is there a difference, how it feels from today, from a difference between the initial concept and initial ideas you had as a curator and the exhibition as it is now? So how does it feel? Does it feel different?
Yes, it does. I mean, there's always the, you know, post-exhibition depression syndrome, where when you're putting it together, it's super exciting because everything seems possible. And then when you start to get used to it, your excitement diminishes. But I think it's also true, you also learn things about it that you couldn't see when you were finishing it. And to me, that's always an interesting process. The French conceptual kind of grandfather, Marcel Duchamp, had a theory that I really believe in, which he gave a strange mathematical name to. He called it the artistic coefficient. And it was a theory that artists begin to make a work, and they have an idea in their head about what that work is going to be about. But they're not always successful. So maybe the work didn't convey everything that they thought it was going to. But because a good artist is also, their unconscious mind is also involved, and that's where the most interesting ideas are going to come from. Other material enters the work of art that the artist isn't aware of at all. So they think the work is to do with what they were consciously thinking of, but in fact it's a mix. So the artist only really knows half of what's going on, which is why the visitor's role is very important. And the same thing happens for curators. You think you know what the experience is, but until you've had time to step away and then see it again, then you suddenly realize completely different thoughts about the exhibition. And that's sometimes a positive experience. Sometimes maybe you're realizing things that you should have done differently. And I think both things happened to me with this show. But it's always interesting. It's like, you know, you want to get to that point where you can look at it as if someone else had curated it.
So again, very open-ended. Very open-ended relationship between the curator and his exhibition. Thank you so much, Ralph. I guess we will open up for the questions from the audience.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. My name is Vladimir, and my question is, I wanted to ask you a question first about do you like to see conflicts and controversial themes in the artist? But now I want to ask you, do you want to see artists who are in the other side of not morally correct, let's say? You understand what I mean? I guess. Thank you.
But let me say, in terms of morally correct, I'd rather see something that raised questions about moral positions that we take for granted and think are unquestionable. Because I don't think we want to have artists preaching to us. And in terms of conflict, yeah, I think art is all about conflict, but not in a literal sense necessarily, though it can deal with literal conflict. Even an abstract painting is only going to be good if it's dealing with conflict, if there's tension in it.
Hello, thank you for coming here and thank you for your honest and fascinating speech. My name is Anastasia, I'm a student and I have 3 questions. First, why did you decide to become a curator? Have you ever regretted this decision, and what advice would you give to young curators, maybe for university students?
Okay, I became a curator by accident. I really didn't know what a curator was. And I gave a lecture once. I was a critic. And I gave a lecture at an art school once. And there was an artist there who heard it, and he said, Ralph, you have to make an exhibition on this subject, and I'll help make it possible. So that happened. That was the first show I ever curated. And I said, gee, this is a lot more fun than writing about someone else's show. And for me, an important part of the exhibition making process is that you have an argument, you have a point of view, and you have to develop it. And so it wasn't that far from writing. And so I would say to curating students, and I've never regretted curating, you know, for someone who didn't know what a curator was until I was probably about 29 years old, I'm very glad I found out. But I would say for curating students, it's very important to write. Because when you write, that's when you really do the serious thinking. You can talk and have a vague idea of what things are like, but when you have to sit down and write, that's when you discover things that you don't know. And I must say, a lot of times, I feel like I only first come to grips with an exhibition when I have to write my exhibition catalog essay. And suddenly I see there, if I'm lucky, there are all kinds of connections between works that beyond the connections I thought I knew about. So writing's just a discipline to get you to think through things in more detail. But it's also good to publish.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Добрый вечер, меня зовут Юрий Гудков.
Good evening. My name is Yuri Gudkov, and the question I have for you. I think this year's biennial has an interesting illustration how the techniques that used to be considered documentary techniques before become messengers for new meanings and become invitations for conversation. How can you characterize, how did the term document change today in this time of change we're living in, these interesting times?
That's a really good question. I really think that art is very different from documentary media like journalism or documentary filmmaking. And there's a lot of artwork out there that I think really is documentary filmmaking rather than art. And I think the difference is that it has to do with form. Art uses forms in ways that that draw our attention to what forms usually try to conceal. And I say the form of a newspaper conceals the idea that a newspaper has a particular point of view and a particular perspective. The form of a newspaper is supposed to seem objective. The newspaper is just telling the truth. But of course, every point of view is just a single point of view and a single perspective. So a good work of art uses forms in a way that make us realize what's at stake. That nothing is cut and dry truth. Nothing can be simply documented as a fact. And I think, for me, there was an example of this was by a very young artist from India. Really a young guy who made a great body of work by taking photographs of people who were living on the street on the outside of Calcutta. So very poor people. And, you know, a journalist would have gone in and taken pictures of sad-looking people lying in the street who obviously had no money, who were supposed to represent an image of poor, down-and-out people, impoverished, penniless people. But this guy did something different. He talked to the people, he got to know them, and he asked them, to act out something that they wanted to act out, to do something that they would like to be shown doing, or to dress in a certain way, to make a certain gesture. So these pictures are slightly theatrical, and sometimes people are doing kind of crazy things. Sometimes they're looking very sad or serious, sometimes they're looking manically happy. But they're all actively engaged. So whereas the journalist might have photographed someone like an object who represents poverty, and the person has no sense of their own individuality, here this guy got them involved in the process, and so you see them as individuals. You don't see them as symbols. And then you spend a lot more time looking at them, because you look at them like you would look like a friend or like yourself in the mirror. You see them in a very different way. So it's in a documentary tradition of street photography, but he took a different approach to add something more complex to it. And I think that, to me, is what makes it art. And I think that's true of, there was another artist, a black American artist, Khalil Joseph, who has a project called Black News that was about the life video project of African American people in the United States. And it's not like any news channel you've ever seen. It's completely conceptual. It's 2 screens. There's music, there's scenes from pop culture, there's YouTube videos, there's interviews. But it gives you a very interesting picture, a positive picture, but also a tragic picture of black life in the United States. But it's not a document, but it's evoking something larger than a fact. So that was definitely something I was thinking about with this exhibition.
Здравствуйте, Ральф.
Hey, Ralph. Thanks for your speech. And I wanted to ask you about the Ukrainian Pavilion. How do you think, did they get the topic? And how critical was it that that plane didn't take off?
Did the Ukrainian Pavilion actually happen? Because all I remember is the proposal.
Yeah, because they were waiting for the plane, but it didn't.
The plane never happened.
The plane never happened.
Yeah, the Ukrainian proposal was very interesting. It was to fly the largest cargo plane in the world over the National Pavilion so its shadow would fall on all of them. It was going to be a very short performance, and the Venice city authorities wouldn't allow it to happen because they didn't want a big plane that low to the ground. So I unfortunately have not seen what was in the Ukraine Pavilion, because I have yet to see all 95 national pavilions, because when you're there, you had no time to see anything. And so I'm going back now a little at a time and seeing the things I've missed. Did you see the Ukrainian Pavilion? No?
Я его не видела, но я занимаюсь исследованием.
I haven't seen it, but right now I'm studying the history of Ukrainian participation in Venice, and I'm very interested in the last one because there's an artistic conflict happening there right now, a generational conflict, and the topic is really interesting. So it's just I got really upset that the plane didn't fly. So I wanted to see how critical that was. Would it have been better had it flown?
Yes, it would have been amazing if it had flown. But, you would have had to take over the city government of Venice for a day.
You work with the artists that reflect on what's happening in a particular country, in the world, in a house, in the soul. How do you think? How can artists influence the reality, and is there a need for that?
That's a really complex question, of course. You know, I don't think artists can directly change the world by making works of art, but they might be able to help change people a little bit. But it takes more than one artwork to change a person. It takes a whole culture, or it takes repeated involvement. And so institutions like this one are very important, where you know you can come over and over again and see what contemporary artists in the world are doing. Art is also, not everybody likes art. Some people like music, some people like theater, some people like other art forms. So I never feel like we have to be missionaries for art. But I think the kind of thinking that's very open that art allows, that kind of engagement is a very good thing, a very positive thing. And when I see, and you don't have to have any training to do it. I mean, all the time I've seen school children who come in to see exhibitions in London, but also in Venice, who have no training in contemporary art. But they're incredibly excited by the things they see. And they come from families who don't take them to museums, right? So this is new. This is like a window opens onto a whole new universe of possibilities. And when I see that excitement, I realize there is something very powerful in contemporary art that can speak to all kinds of people. But for some reason, not enough people get to see it. It's not a mass medium, art. You know, I was talking to a journalist earlier today about the television program Chernobyl. Has anyone seen this TV show? Yeah? No? Nobody's seen it? Yes. Yes. And it sounds like a really good, sophisticated, complex program. It sounds like a work of art. But the advantage of television is that maybe 50 million people can see this. But 50 million people can't see an exhibition. But you can have, I think there are many more exhibitions in the world than there are films or TV shows that get made. So it works in a different way. But I think, you know, I think institutions have a big responsibility to make everybody feel welcome. And, you know, there are a lot of artists in the world who take very strong political positions and want to change the way people think about an issue. And for me, that usually means that you get art that's one-dimensional, because it says there's only one way to think. And I think art should be about opening up questions and realizing that there's different ways to think.
Hello?
And I'll just say one more thing, and that is, to me, the most important political thing that you can do with art is to make sure everybody has access to it. Because it can change any person's life. But a lot of museums don't do that. They put people off. They make people think art, you have to be very smart to understand it because the wall labels are incomprehensible, and if you read them you think, God, get me out of here. Or they feel very like they're only places for smart, educated, rich people to go. It doesn't feel like it's where you come from. So there's a lot of work can be done to make art have more effect in the world. Sorry.
Yep. Hello, my name is Yulia, and first of all, thank you very much for fascinating exhibitions in Venice, and thank you for this, in a way, thought-provoking talk. I have two short questions. First of them, in your opinion, is the gender of an artist somehow reflected in their works of art? And did you try to come up with a gender-balanced exhibition when choosing the artists who would be represented in Venice? Thank you.
I think sometimes gender comes through in one way or another, but gender more and more is such a fluid thing. All the boundaries that people used to use to assign gender now are much more blurred. And of course, gender has also become a subject for many artists, many people who have non-binary genders. And it's interesting because I think for me, the basic impulse of contemporary art is to question the categories and concepts that we use to make sense of the world. So it's trying to disrupt our habits and all the props that we use to see order, or maybe there is no order sometimes. And I think we just had an exhibition at the Hayward that was about people of open-ended gender. And I thought this is actually one of the perfect subjects for contemporary art, because these are people who are saying gender categories don't work. And contemporary art is already about disputing the way, and trying to fit in between categories. So when you see a painter who's making a painting that's partly abstract, partly representational, it's doing this kind of thing. It's questioning those categories in a way. In terms of gender balance, yes, it was something I thought about. And different people have counted the artists in this show in different ways. But apparently there's one way of counting them where it's the first time there was more women artists than men. I never managed to count it that way. I always thought it was maybe one more male artist. But it was very close in either case.
Thank you for your lecture. My name is Alla Wagner, Temple University, and I have a couple of questions for you. You mentioned in the beginning of your lecture that the world has become polarized recently, especially in the past 2 years, as well as I think you've mentioned that there has become a wider gap between the rich and poor in the world in the past years. How do you personally think that reflected in the art of especially the artists you've been dealing with, the ones that were represented in your Biennale? And my second question would be, what are the methods that artists use that particularly appeal to you, such as contrasting, improvising, shocking, I don't know, any methods? Thank you.
I think one of the main things that we've seen happen in the world in the last 30 years is that wealth has become increasingly concentrated in a very small elite group. And this is true in almost every country in the world. It doesn't matter whether it's a neoliberal, so-called democratic country, or if it's a dictatorship. This has been a really disturbing trend. How do you represent that in an art exhibition? And one very simple thing, and one thing I wanted to make sure was in this exhibition, was that there were images that definitely brought to mind people who are on the poorest end of the spectrum, who often don't get a place in an art gallery. I then tried to think about how do you represent the other side, the 1% of the 1%, the super rich, the billionaires, the oligarchs. And I know people talk about the Russian oligarchs, but we have oligarchs in every country. And I couldn't find really images that I thought were interesting enough. But I think there's just a very strong sense of something out of balance. So I think you get some images that show some kind of disturbance in the social fabric that happens when I think wealth is so unequally distributed. Because with wealth comes power. So it just means that power is given to this smaller and smaller group of people. And that other people, whether or not you have a vote or you don't have a vote, you don't have that power. And in terms of a preferred method, I like to be surprised. So to me, that's one of the great pleasures of art, is it gives you pleasure that you can't anticipate. A pleasure that maybe you didn't even know existed before, right? If it gives you the same pleasure that you know, that's like a formula. That's why I go to see a Hollywood thriller. I know what I'm going to get, and it delivers it, and that's that. But from art, I want something, another kind of pleasure. So anything that can deliver that, I'm very happy with as an approach. All right, well, thank you all very much for very good questions, for coming tonight.
Большое спасибо всем.
Well, thank you all for the questions and for being here. I would like to thank our guest, Ralph Rugoff, and our partners today, the Italian Cultural Institute, and Ms. Paolo Lucioni, and Consulate General of Italy in St. Petersburg, and Mega Dibenko. Thank you, and see you in Manege next time.